Good afternoon, everyone. So today we're going to tackle two sets of topics: practice policies and disease management, outcomes management, as well as case management. So all of these are management tools. So let's start first with practice policies. What are the most familiar practice policies to you? Probably these are going to be clinical practice guidelines. However, it's not limited to that. So we're going to tackle um, what practice policies mean. So why were practice policies developed? They were actually developed in response to the challenge of variability. Every patient is not the same, right? However, how do physicians tailor these treatments to their patients? So traditionally or conventionally, we have relied on unsystematic observations. Meron nga tinatawag na, or there's what we call experience-based medicine. So based on anecdotal evidence, I have treated this kind of patient before. Okay, so based on a provider's personal experience, guided by understanding of disease processes and pathophysiology. But of course, take note that book knowledge may not translate into the clinical setting. And lastly, there may be variations in medical training, clinical experience, as well as common sense. For example, if you ask a certain doctor, why do they prescribe this medication? Some of them would answer because that's what they do in their training institution, or that's how they were taught by their mentors, or an appeal to common sense, but there's actually not much evidence to it. So the remedy to all of this is evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine actually accepts traditional premises, but it adds systematic recording of outcomes. So we're trying to remove biases, and also we're trying to do a proper literature search and proper evaluation of evidence. Okay, so we're trying to balance documented evidence as well as authority. So it doesn't mean that we're heavily or just relying on published evidence. So it's actually more of a balancing act. Okay, so it challenges us to search and evaluate clinical studies. So these are our learning objectives for this first half of the lecture. So we've already tackled evidence-based medicine. We're going to describe the idealized clinical decision-making process, as well as the goals, structure, and implementation of practice policies. Okay, is there a role for information technology? Maybe, and we're going to review its effect on medical practice. Okay, so practice policies are recommendations on treatment. It tells us how to treat our patients. In other words, in Filipino, mga alituntunin sa paggamot ng mga pasyente. The applicability is determined by the level of information known about the medical condition as well as the patient preferences. Okay? So it's the result of providers, insurers, and government recognizing the inherent uncertainty and variability of medical practice. So the goal, of course, is to provide better patient care through effective and efficient medical practice based on proper evidence. So the focus is on the process of care, specifically defined steps, provide the rules as well as the timing of actions. However, the challenges that have been encountered in adopting practice policies have been the slow adoption due to passive dissemination, competing guidelines, as well as physician opposition. Why do we need these practice policies? It's because there is a demand for greater clarity in medical decisions. So previously, doctors have been relying on their judgment based on their experience and their personal understanding of disease processes. However, in our modern day and age, there has been a demand for some sense of accountability of medical professionals. It comes with the recognition of human cognitive limitations. We accept that even doctors um, with a decline in the paternalistic view of medical professionals, we have recognized that even doctors could make mistakes and could have limitations in terms of their understanding of diseases. Aside from that, computers can now track information and assist decision making. In other words, there's already an abundance of information that could be utilized to guide our decision making. Aside from that, there is already a documented difference in practice patterns. Also, so for example, if you're looking for a doctor in this particular locality, and then if you consult with a doctor in another place, you could note that there are a lot of differences in terms of practice. So depending on your access to certain doctors, you could be subjected to different kinds of treatment, and some of those treatment could be unnecessary. Aside from that, in the US especially, because of their healthcare system, there's a continuing growth in healthcare expenditures. However, in the US, that amount of expenditure does not match the actual um, improvement in health of the people on the ground. So there's a natural demand as well of higher quality as societies become wealthier. But just because you spend money on the healthcare problem does not mean that the health of the people would be improved. Lastly, there is a growing public skepticism towards professionals and a demand for accountability. And in fact, in the US, they have what we call a litigious culture, meaning they threaten healthcare professionals that they would sue them. They would sue the professionals if they make any mistakes. And that's something that we just don't see in our Filipino culture. But still, there's still a public skepticism towards the healthcare profession here in the Philippines. If you would remember, cases such as those of the Tulfo when he went into the emergency room, trying to ask for doctors were trying to shame doctors because of his what he did to his patient, right? So ideally, how should clinical decisions be made? So Eddie in 1990s made a model that outlined the six-step process for selecting treatment. It integrates objective evidence with the subjective values of the patient. So essentially, it can be divided between two phases, analysis and evaluation. In analysis, you start with the existing medical evidence. Then you apply the clinical judgment of the provider, the doctor, in other words. Here, you consider the patient's unique circumstances. In other words, their age, their other illnesses or comorbidities, and as a result, you generate a set of potential treatments and their outcomes. You need to have accurate information regarding the benefits and harms of the treatment. From there, you do evaluation. You explain the plausible treatments and outcomes to the patient, and from there, you incorporate patient preference. And together, the patient and the physician will determine the course of treatment. Okay? And here you apply a practice policy to choose the specific treatment plan. However, although this is the ideal process, there are challenges along the way. It's actually often impractical due to significant time and resource constraints. For example, it is time consuming. The extensive amount of evidence that must be considered can take significant provider time. If you're going to research all of the evidence for that particular case every time you do a consult, then you're never going to finish the consults for the day. Aside from that, there may also be conflicting evidence. For example, published research is often contradictory. That's why we shouldn't rely on just one research paper to, to base our clinical decisions. Because oftentimes, you're going to find one research that makes a specific claim and another research that makes exactly the opposite claim. Okay? And of course, you're going to need shortcuts. Researchers rely on their knowledge base as well as pre-consultation, and this can lag behind advances in medical practice by as much as 17 years. And here in the Philippines, this could lag even more, right? Because it's very rare that physicians are very up to date with medical advances. Okay? So the goal of practice policies would be to try to shorten this lag, to facilitate decision making by centralizing data collection and analysis, thus saving physician time. Now that we know the purpose of practice policies, let's look at the different types of practice policies. So this is one of the earliest classifications of practice policies. Clinical pathways versus clinical practice guidelines. But in the next slide, I'm going to discuss three types of practice policies different from this one. Okay? So what's the difference between a pathway and a clinical practice guideline? A pathway is a timeline of services to be rendered. So it involves not just doctors, but all healthcare workers. It's also not limited to a single event. In contrast, clinical practice guidelines are made by physicians for physicians, meaning it helps physicians to decide which diagnostics to order and which treatment to prescribe. So they are often event specific and geared primarily for physician use. Right? This slide shows another classification of practice policies, standards, guidelines, and options. And they are differentiated based on rigidity. Standards are the most rigid type. It assumes a strong evidence of effectiveness and near unanimous patient preference. In other words, standards should be followed in almost every case. In contrast, guidelines are less rigid. So you could use them when there's dispute over treatment effectiveness or when patient preference is general but not unanimous. They should be followed in most cases. But the one that is built on the least amount of knowledge are options. Options that just gives you options or choices. In other words, use them when there is little evidence to support one treatment over another. So the actual choice is left to the physicians and patients. This practice policy matrix is a table that summarizes the choice between a standard, a guideline, or an option. Again, the most stringent is a standard. It you could use a standard when patient preference is unanimous as well as clinician preference and when the outcome is known. If there's any dispute when it comes to outcome and if the preferences are not unanimous, they should use a guideline. And the least definitive out of all of these would be options. Okay? So policies become restrictive only when agreement on outcomes and patient preferences is high. Only 10 to 20% of medical practice is actually based on published scientific evidence. Okay, so in the modern day, despite claims that medicine has really advanced and has become really scientific, actually very small decisions made in the clinics are actually based on published evidence. That's why medicine still remains an art. Now let's learn what are the parts or components of a practice policy. David Eddy outlined 13 components that a comprehensive practice policy should have in order to be clear, transparent, and useful. The first part, of course, is the summary. It's like the abstract. It tells you immediately what the policy is about. Is it a guideline? Is it a standard or an option? Okay. Next would be the background. It tells you the basis for writing this study. Third is the health problem or issue. It could highlight or outline the different prevalence of the disease, etc. Aside from the prevalence of the disease, it could also specify whether there is a new development in terms of treatment that necessitated the need for writing this current practice policy, right? Fourth is the current health and economic outcomes. And fifth is the most important one. It outlines the different supporting evidence for your recommendations. Okay. Sixth is the expected effect on health and economic outcomes. If in number four, we have the current outcomes. Number six is the expected effect once we implement the different recommendations. Seventh is the evaluation of clinical effectiveness. Eight is evaluation of patient preferences. Nine is patient-specific tailoring of guideline and options. 10 is any conflict with other practice policies that are pre-existing. 11 is comparison with other interventions for other health problems. And lastly, for number 12, we have the caveats. And of course, you have the authors. Developing the policy is just the first step. Effective dissemination and use at the patient bedside are critical for improving care. However, adoption of these practice policies may be limited because of certain barriers. So, Cabana et al. In 1999 identified the following barriers to use. For knowledge, there may be a lack of awareness of the policy's existence. So, those who made the policy should also be involved in making the clinicians aware of the existence of the policy. Next would be attitudes. It doesn't mean that because you have synthesized the evidence clearly, doesn't mean that um, clinicians are going to adapt it readily. Because there may be some disagreement with the policy's recommendations. Remember, medicine is still an art. And lastly, behavior. There may be resistance to implementing the policy for various factors, such as inconvenience, a lack of time, or even just the inertia of previous practice. If clinicians have done it this way for decades, then they may be less susceptible or less welcoming of new developments in terms of practice. So, what are some of the strategies we could do to make sure that implementation is going to be successful? First, of course, is to make it an interdisciplinary team. If the clinician in the first place is a part of the team that developed it, then it's going to be easier for them to adopt it. And I've mentioned interdisciplinary. That doesn't mean that it just involves different specialties. It also needs to involve different professions, such as nurses, pharmacists, and management, because they are acutely aware of the things that are on the ground. Next would be make a convincing case for change. You should use your data to demonstrate a performance gap. Show clearly how it is going to improve the performance of the health system. Of course, there should be active dissemination. You could do seminars, targeted to the end users. You could also do outreach visits as well as endorsement by opinion leaders. For example, a well-respected doctor in the field. and not just mass mailings. Okay? You should also use effective tools such as computer reminders, provider feedback, and peer review. And lastly, you need to monitor compliance and outcomes. You need to track process indicators and simulate the results quickly to encourage the staff to adopt it. What are some approaches that could lead to poor implementation? So therefore, you should avoid them. Some of these include across the board training. If you use a one size fits all model, it's going to be ineffective. It can only inhibit open discussion. You should also avoid big teams. The optimal group size is around 5 to 7 people. Larger groups are going to hinder communication. There should be too many teams. A shotgun approach, which uses multiple simultaneous initiatives, is going to dissipate energy as well as confuse priorities. Delegated responsibility. If the top management isn't actively engaged, employees won't commit. And lastly, wrong timing. Starting prematurely before the need for change is established or waiting too long until the urgency is lost is going to lead to poor implementation. One of the ways to improve implementation is through the use of CDS or computer decision support. Its goal is to provide the right information to the right person in the right format to the right channel at the right point in the workflow to improve healthcare decisions and outcomes. Okay, so computer decision support just uses computer systems in order to improve decision making, or specifically medical decision making. Evidence suggests that CDS could increase the percentage of patients receiving guideline consistent care. However, CDS must still overcome barriers such as nonconformance with current workflows, as well as low system performance and information overload. Don't need to give all the information all at once to the decision maker. You need to just give it at the right time. Okay? CDS must also allow physicians to state reasons for non-adherence. So in other words, it should consider human decision making. And lastly, physician adherence can be stopped by patient disbelief or non-adherence to prior recommendations. So just because it is written in the policy guideline or just because it is written in your clinical practice guideline doesn't mean that the patient is going to find it acceptable. So there's still a human element involved in here. So how could practice policies improve practice? Let's look first into this case, which is a case of adult respiratory distress syndrome. So in this particular study done by Brent James at Intermountain Healthcare, it tackled high mortality rates and extreme variability in terms of ventilator use for ARDS patients. So a protocol was first developed. A detailed ventilator management protocol was created, but there was still some flexibility to allow for learning from deviations. The results showed that improved compliance from below 50% to over 80%. Aside from this, it leads to improved survival of patients. High-risk patient survival increased from just around 10% to 44% with the new protocol. But also, aside from improving patient survival, it led to reduced costs. So the stabilized protocol just cost 120,000 per case versus the 160,000 for the alternative. So the key lesson here is that reducing inappropriate variations is the key to identifying effective treatments and improving outcomes. However, take note that not all practice policies are going to be successful. So in this list or in these three case studies, we could see that the results could vary very much. For example, in the case of CKD, a study on iron management guideline found low and inconsistent adherence. So if commitment is lacking, providers don't see that the protocol has clear evidence, then they won't follow it. So it's not going to lead to any improvement in patient outcome. Just because you have a practice policy, that doesn't mean that it's going to lead to a good support. In contrast, in antibiotic guidelines, the computer-assisted decision support system led to dramatic improvements, lower mortality rates, decreased adverse drug events, and a 57% reduction in cost per patient. And lastly, it may have no significant impact at all. It may not worsen, but it may also not improve patient outcomes. So, for example, a study on diabetes found that even with a computer-assisted decision support system, that there was no significant change in doctors' behavior or patient outcomes, highlighting the difficulty of changing practice for chronic conditions, specifically because doctors are very set in their ways in terms of treating these very common conditions. In summary, variability is inherent in healthcare. That's really part of what we do as doctors. Practice policies are a crucial tool to reduce unwarranted variation by integrating evidence and patient preferences into treatment decisions. However, the success of practice policies hinge on making a persuasive case for change, as well as effective implementation, often through the aid of information technology. While some initiatives show dramatic success, others yield meager results, proving that improving care is a continuous challenge that requires adapting policies to the local work culture and demonstrating their value to providers. Now let's look to the second half of our lecture. It involves case management, disease management, as well as outcomes management. Now, do you remember the Pareto principle? The Pareto principle applies in healthcare as well. So, a small number of patients and conditions account for a disproportionately large share of healthcare spending. So you're going to encounter common diseases, and these could be targeted using different management tools. And these management tools are the ones that we're going to talk about today. So these management tools differ on their focus. So for example, case management focuses on an individual patient. Next would be disease management. Disease management focus on a group of patients with a certain high-cost chronic condition. Lastly, outcomes management involves measuring results to determine which treatments work best for which patients. We're going to look at each one of them in turn. In case management, again, you look into an individual patient. It's a health delivery process whose goal is to provide quality health care, decrease fragmentation, enhance the patient's quality of life, and contain costs. It represents a shift in oversight and coordination from physicians to nurses or other dedicated managers. So take note, your case manager is not necessarily a health professional, but most of the time it's usually a nurse. So there are four major functions of the case manager. It involves assessing the patient in terms of patient, family, and resources. It involves continuous data gathering. So it's not just at the start and on the end of treatment, it's continuous. Next would be planning. In other words, incorporating data into a detailed care plan. Monitoring, assessing the performance of the treatment plan, and tracking variances. And lastly, discharge planning. So even in health, with regards to transition of care from the inpatient setting to outside, it could involve your case manager. Next, with disease management, you target a certain group of chronic conditions. Specifically, you want to target conditions in which patient self-care is significant. So here you want to standardize your care for this group of patients with the same conditions. As you could see, this usually involves those with pulmonary conditions, mental disorders, as well as cancer. So next, we're going to look in how to develop a disease management program. Here are the steps in developing a disease management program. First, you need to define the disease, specifically its scope and impact. Then you develop baseline information on treatment and resource use. You generate the questions and research the literature. In our case, since we're in the field of medicine, we're going to search the database, PubMed. Then we critically appraise and synthesize the evidence. What you evaluate are the benefits, harms, and costs. Next, we develop guidelines for professional and self-management. Step 7, we create a system for process and outcome measurement. And then finally, we implement the program. Of course, because we need to complete the quality improvement cycle, there needs to be continuous measurement of outcomes. In disease management, one of the important aspects is to improve the patient's ability to manage their own conditions. In other words, self-care. This requires overcoming patient resistance to change. So, in order to do that, we have the following motivational interviewing techniques. First, you need to express empathy. You need to establish rapport and understand the patient's perspective. Develop discrepancy. Help the patient see the incompatibility between their current behavior and their long-term health goals. So, show them that their current behavior, the current way that they care for themselves, is going to lead to bad outcomes later on. Next, you need to roll with resistance. Don't oppose resistance directly. So imagine that if you tell a patient not to eat fatty food, that's going to cause craving for fatty food even more. So don't oppose it directly. Instead, you should redirect the patient's energy towards searching for alternatives. Lastly, support self-efficacy. Promote the patient's belief that they are in control of their condition, that they could make a difference in their own lives, and that they do not necessarily need professional intervention automatically. However, take note that the evidence for disease management is at best inconclusive. It has been found that most of the improvement is in terms of intermediate outcomes like patient satisfaction and adherence.
and it has no major effect on health outcomes or reduce hospitalizations. In other words, you're not necessarily going to save lives, but you're going to make your patient happy by teaching them to take care of themselves properly in disease management. For example, a review published in 2004 found that there was insufficient evidence to conclude that disease management programs can generally reduce the overall cost of healthcare services. De Bruin in 2011 found that some savings for heart failure and COPD, but evidence for cost reduction claims are still inclusive. In other words, we're not saving money by implementing disease management. And lastly, Hoffman in 2004 found that diabetes programs were effective at improving patient satisfaction as well as adherence, but little improvement in cost reduction as well as hospitalization. In other words, we're not really preventing um, complications from diabetes. We're just helping the patient follow their treatment plan better. And lastly, we have outcomes management. So out of the three, case management, disease management, and outcomes management is the broadest out of all these tools. It defines an ongoing process to measure, monitor, and improve results. It comes closest to the idea of evidence-based medicine, aiming to create a system for understanding what treatment works best for which patients. Okay? So Elwood has this vision for outcomes management that we're going to use patient understood language of outcomes, and that there is a national database of clinical, financial, and health outcomes. And lastly, to create a clinical trial machinery to rapidly assess the effectiveness of new treatments. Overall, case, disease, and outcomes management share the common goal of improving patient outcomes through better coordination, planning, and measurement. They aim to systematize care, enhance teamwork, and empower patients. While the promise of significantly better outcomes and lower costs has not been consistently proven in studies, these management tools provide a valuable framework for assessing operations and fostering a more collaborative, patient-centered approach to care. The true value lie in improving processes and communication, even if direct financial or major health outcome improvements are hard to demonstrate. That's it for our lecture for today. Thank you very much, everyone. And if you have any questions, just message me. Thank you.